Hi, welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial today here on YouTube, I'd like to share a design with you which is completely accessible to total beginners. It's how to halo a bead. So the bead in the centre is a coin bead, which is to say that it is mostly flat with some slight shaping to the edges. I'll show you an alternative bead to that in just a moment. And then I'm going to add some 4mm faceted beads around the outside. It's very, very easy to master this technique. It doesn't have to be used with round faceted coin beads. Almost any bead that has a drill hole can be suspended in the same way as we're about to learn together now. So for our halo design, we're going to be working with an 18mm coin bead. It's reasonably flat, it does have a little bit of chamfering to those edges, and it's a faceted bead. It could be a flat coin bead, it doesn't have to be faceted, as long as you do have a drill hole, and that will fit your central wire, which is a 0.6mm or a 22 gauge. I'm just going to chat to you quickly about the wires now as well. We're working with just 2 gauges today. I have some 1.25mm or 16 gauge, and I also have a length of 0.6mm or 22 gauge to work with. I'm working with round wire in raw copper. In addition to my focal bead, I have a handful of 4mm faceted round beads. These are a beautiful quality of Labradorite. You can work obviously with whatever beads you fancy, as long as the drill hole fits on the lighter gauge wire, the 0.6 or 22 gauge. All will be well. Now this is a solar quartz, not entirely sure what this one is. It's very pretty, could be a chrysoprase. And around the outside I have some really beautiful amazonite, although we'll be adding some labradorites onto the piece we work on together. So your tools for today's tutorial are cutters, bent chain nose, you could use any chain nose or flat pliers, and also some round nose pliers. In addition to this, I will be using a round form mandrel. I have my purple mandrel from Beadalon, which is absolutely fabulous, but you could, if you preferred, simply use a lip balm or a lip gloss or something like that. What we're looking to do to begin with is to create a round form which is just a little bit larger than the bead we're going to be working with. So as ever, we're going to be starting with our warming of the wire. So I have approximately 10 inches or so of the 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, and I'm just going to grip hold of the one end of this with my pliers whilst I get it a little bit more fluid and pliable by applying thumb and forefinger to generate some heat into that wire. So I'm just going to grab a mandrel or a round form to generate a shape just slightly larger than the bead we're going to be using, and what I want to see is a couple of inches of excess wire at one end. So I'm just going to wrap this gently around the mandrel to begin with at a point that I believe would be suitable, and if you don't leave yourself enough space, as I haven't here, you can roll that along a little bit as you need to. So I'm just going to open that out and see if the bead does fit inside. So I've made this just a little bit too small, so we're going to pop that back onto the mandrel and just push that up the mandrel, or if you prefer, choose a slightly larger pot lid or similar. I've also just moved that circular form along, so I have an excess just on the end here of 2 inches or so. So let's try that again. Little bit of a space around the edge, that is indeed what we need to see. So I'm going to pop the bead over to one side and I'll draw the finished piece just so that it's down into view. So the first thing that I'm going to need is to take the long end of wire and pop a right angle bend in that side. So if I bring that into position, hold that firmly with my bent chain nose pliers and put a right angle bend coming away at the top. Let's imagine that's the 12 o'clock position that we're going to be working with. We'll form that later into a very simple bail and add a flourish of your choice. What we need to do at this point is make sure that the bead will fit inside the design, and there's a little bit of space around the edges there. So you can see there's probably around about a 1mm gap all the way around. So I imagine then that this circular form we've made will be around about the 20 to 21mm diameter, being as the bead is around about the 18mm mark. So I'm just going to open that out ever so slightly, flip the design over so that the shorter tail of wire is going over the top, And what I'm going to do here is just hold my pliers in position for a moment. I'm holding the end which comes away like so, and I'm just going to put a very, very small angle coming up at around about 45 degrees. Now the reason for this is it means that I can open out like a jump ring and grip just past the angle that we've simply created a moment ago, and I'm going to push the shorter tail of wire back and around. Having that very small moment of change of direction means that when you push everything back together, you actually end up with a fluid circular form. If you start wrapping around the elongated wire, which will be our neck wire coming away to a bail in a little while, what can happen is you end up with one side of your circle is slightly higher than the other. And what we're trying to do is to create something a little bit like a clock face. So once I'm happy that that is the correct size and shape, I'm going to offer my bead back in, and you'll see that I enlarged that ever so slightly a moment ago, just when I opened that design out, to give me a little bit more movement. You definitely need at least 1 millimetre larger than your central focal bead. So what I'm going to do now is squish by hand so that that short tail of wire starts circling around the neckline of the piece. If I pop this down onto the board, you'll be able to see the small angle that we made has meant that we have that beautiful perfect round shape to work with later on. Now what will want to happen, especially in a slightly heavier wire like this 16 gauge or 1.25 millimetre, as you start to take this tail around the neck, we're going to create a little bit of a vortex or a little coil going up the neckline here. What will happen is that this section will want to move across and become part of that motion. Now we need to try and stop that because we've made a shape which we're really happy with. So I'm just going to hold on to that side, the right hand side for me of the design, just while I bring that tail around for the first really hard bend that we're going to make. If I push that across the top, you'll see what we've done is preserved the size and shape of our design, and that's one of the reasons I try to add a little bit of extra space. So what we've done by adding that little bit of extra space before we made that first bend is allowed ourselves a contingency, a margin of error. So we're going to continue by taking the short tail around the neck just a couple of turns to create a little bit of coiling, and we're going to create a really lovely strong neck to work from. So we need to preserve this shape as best we can, and one of the ways to do that is to get in control of that first circuit of wire, the first part of the coil, and just give that a really good squish. If you misshape it slightly, you can just smooth that back down. So what I'm going to do again is just hold on to the wire on the right hand side of that upright and take the wire that is going on the short end around that neck section. You can make this in a slightly lighter gauge wire to practice if you prefer, but the longevity of the design is much, much better if you're working with that 1.25 millimetre or 16 gauge. So I'm just going to tighten up that coil that we've made. This is a really good, strong start to the design and will mean that it lasts for ever such a long time. So I'm left now with just over 1 inch of wire. And what we're going to do is to turn this little tail into a coil and just hold it out of the way for the time being. So I've got a flush cut end here. If you don't have the flush end cut, just apply the flush side of your cutters and just trim any excess off. Just keep it so that it's around about 1 inch and a bit. End of the pliers to the end of the wire, and I'm just going to start rotating that around and up. If I tilt that slightly, you can see that I'm just making very small movements to get that into the beginnings of a spiral. It's kind of difficult to show that to you with a wire sticking up and not hitting the camera with it. So I'm just going to twist that around slightly until we get the beginnings of a coil. I'm just going to bring that coil all the way home, but leave it sticking out at 90 degrees to the neckline that we've created. So if I turn this around to the correct orientation, we're going to offer our bead into position. Now that solar quartz is sitting quite nicely now. So what we're going to do is ignore this for a little while. We're going to create the halo first before we set the stone. And the reason for that is it is much easier to handle the length of wire that we're going to be working with when there's no central stone. So on the first piece, I made this one. I set the stone first and then had to continually twist the stone out of the way to make access easy. So I learnt. And then what I decided to do was we'll be adding the lighter wire next so that we can add on our lovely Labradorite beads. So if I bring the length of wire that we're going to be working with into view, this is 0.6mm or 22 gauge wire, and I have around about 16 inches or so. Now I'm working with an 18mm central bead. If you're working with a much larger bead, you will need a longer length of wire here, and you'll also need more. I think there's around about 13 on this piece, but you will need more beads to fill that space. You could of course space them out a little bit further if you desire, but I kind of like the aesthetic of having them not jam-packed, but really quite a lot of beads going around the outside. It lends the element of that halo design. So what we're going to do is choose our starting point. And I think I'd like to start on the left and work around. So I'm going to flip the design over onto its back for the time being. And what I need to do is get a good grip around the frame wire. It doesn't matter if you start from the left or the right, it's entirely up to you. But I'm going to allow myself about, let's go with it, just under ½ an inch. And I'm going to start by bending that around the frame wire. It can be a little bit away from that nexus point if you desire, if it makes your life easier. And what we're going to do is to go for 3 wraps. 3 wraps is enough to be secure. We're going to be building up a whole raft of sets of 3 wraps. But it's nice, it's a good number to work with in beading. I think it lends a nice design aesthetic. So I'm just going to twist that coil around until it sits neatly. And the very, very end of that wire is pushed flush to the wire inside the frame. So the very, very end piece sits inside, where it will sit against the bead and not against hair or skin or clothing. If I flip this over to the front now, you'll see what we need to do is spin this around and get it sat up into position so you can see what I'm talking about. I need to just make sure that that end section is inside the frame when we're ready to go. Give that a little bit of a twist and tweak around. Get that nice and smooth and sit it hard up against the shoulder. So I'm working from the left-hand side of that upright, which will become our simple bail later on. What I'm going to do to make my life easier is now spin this around so the design is upside down. My finer gauge wire is coming over the top of my frame wire. It doesn't matter if you start over the top and move to underneath or the other way around, as long as what you're doing is going from one side to the other, and I will show you that technique now. So I'm just going to grab myself a single bead from my strand, and I'm going to slide that down onto my length of finer gauge wire on this design. So what it needs to do is sit pushed flush against the outside of our ring of copper that we've created together. And I'm going to just pinch that into position whilst I take the tail of the wire. It came over the top to begin with. We added the bead, so it now needs to go underneath. So this is a wiring on or adding on gemstones, and what I'm doing is I'm pushing all of that finer gauge wire through the centre of the ring that we created. I'm going to pull that really firmly. What I'm aiming for is to have tension, but not so much that we crack the bead. Now Labradorite is a lovely bead to work with. It's not particularly hard, it's not particularly soft. However, what Labradorite does have, that some gemstones don't, is small fractures inside, occasionally, which can mean that your bead will shatter, especially if you're working with glass or crystal beads. That can be a risk. So I work with Labradorite all the time, and I get to know the feeling that this is actually going to be pretty safe and secure. But if you want to start working with gemstones, then a nice agate, an onyx, or a quartz will be a really lovely way to get going, especially with a halo design like this, because they catch the light. So I've added my bead into position. The wires come over the top of the ring, through the bead, and then past underneath the ring, up and through and over the top. So we're going to coil 3 times around that ring wire. So that's 1 and 2. Your bead might wiggle around a little bit to begin with, so you might want to just grip hold of that with your non-dominant hand. And I'm going to go for 3 times around the ring. Just caught hold of the central focal then. Until we've got 3 visible wraps, added a bead from the top around underneath to the bottom side, up through the centre, and then we've got 3 more wraps. So I now need to find the end of my wire and grab myself a second bead. Now I find with a design like this that having an odd number of beads going onto the design is quite pleasing, but you can do exactly the number of beads and spacing that you prefer. You might want to wire on 5 times, add a bead, wrap around 5 times, add a bead. It's entirely up to you. When you create a design like this, you are totally in control of the finished result. So I'm going to grip a hold of the bead, take the tail of that wire around underneath and up through the centre. So you can see the wire is getting slightly tense already. So this is the leading edge technique, where I push the leading edge through. If this makes you unhappy for some reason, you can take the tail of the wire and push that up through the centre of the ring. What you'll find is that you still have an inch or so of quite tense wire in the middle. So it's entirely up to you, whatever technique works best. And what we're going to do is wire all the way around until we get to the other side, when we're going to finish with 3 wraps hard up against the neck. So here is one that I created earlier and then instantly put a pair of pliers on top of, because I'm just that clever. There we go. So we've had our ring of wire, and we've gone for 3 wraps and a bead, 3 wraps and a bead, and we're always moving. If we start on the top side of that ring, we're going, after the bead has been added, then we're going to go to the other side, so from top to bottom, as you prefer. When we have completed our circuit of halo beads, hopefully you can see up there, if I just bring that slightly closer for a moment, we finished off with 3 wraps around at the shoulder of that ring design. So now the proof of the pudding comes into play. Will this bead go on the wire? Did I check it earlier? Because I can't actually remember. If not, I have other beads available. So with the best will in the world, sometimes the bead just won't go on the wire. So luckily for me, I have a strand of round coin beads that are all the same size. So I'm going to introduce an alternative bead to the centre of the piece that we're making together today. So I have a red moss agate to work with today, which does fit on my wire, and I'm just going to slide that all the way down until it sits on that frame wire, on the lighter gauge wire, and you can see that that is going to fit exactly the same way as the other piece that we worked with together. So this is where we left off, wired all the way around, and then wrapped 3 times up at the shoulder before adding on my focal bead. So at this point, what we're going to do is find a place approximately opposite where we are currently at with the finer gauge wire, and we're going to try and hide the tail of our wire away. Now I think I'm just going to insert it just down the side of these 3 wraps down at the bottom, like so, and I'm going to draw that wire across the back. Now if you wish to, what you can do is prevent your bead from spinning in its situ. I quite like the fact that this one spins, so I'm going to leave that one alone. All I would do is wrap around a couple of times at the base before cutting and hiding the end of the wire away. If I wanted to prevent it from moving, I could take this tail wire from point to point, wrap around and hide that wrap inside one of these little trio of wraps on either side. Or you can simply take it back up to the top. It's entirely up to you. That will stop it from spinning all the way around. But if you want to prevent it from moving, you can take it from point to point. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to take the tail of the wire all the way through, like so, until that sits neatly in with the design. And then I'm going to flip over onto the back so you can see what we're doing. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to find somewhere I can smuggle this wire so that it sits neatly inside the design. So I've just found a gap on one of those trio of wraps. I'm going to pull that all the way through until it sits tightly and firmly inside that design. So just going to pull until that's nice and tight. Reform those little halo beads. Let's just pop that down for a second. So what we've done is we've set our disc bead in the centre of the ring that we created together, and now we've stopped it from moving around. So I'm going to take that tail wire all the way up to the neck, and I'm just going to wrap a couple of times around the neck wire. I think I'll go for maybe 5 times, finishing off neatly to one side. Just give that a bit of a trim, pop that in the scrap pot for later, and neatening down at that end like so. So that's the basis of our design. If you want your central focal bead to spin, just wrap a couple of times around the perimeter and then cut, push the end away. If you don't want the bead to spin, you can just do a quick little bit of back and forth across there, and that will prevent it from moving around. So what I might do is just undo that now and show you the alternative design in live rather than explaining it. So the easiest way to actually get that off is to cut here and withdraw this piece carefully, because it's very painful when the end of the wire goes into your fingertip. So that's out of the way for now. And we're just going to undo what we did earlier, which was to prevent that bead from moving. So what I need to do is just undo, which obviously you wouldn't be doing this because you would decide what you wanted to achieve at the point in time. So I'm just going to pull this section away, push that back through. Might need to just pull that from the front. Hopefully you won't have to go through this part of the process. This is just me showing you two different ways to finish your design. So if you want your central bead to spin, what we're going to do is take the tail around the ring section that we created together. So I'm going to push that down through into the hole. I'm going to give that 1 and 2 to tie off. So I'm just going to trim the end away here, and then make sure that you don't smash your beads. Hide that little tail away in the back, like so. Give it the rub test so that you don't catch your finger on it. And then what we're going to do is push the disc coil that we created in the first part of the tutorial. I'm going to push that down into position. And that's just a nice bit of added decorative detail. So you've got two alternatives of how you might like to set that central disc bead. It doesn't have to be a faceted disc bead, could be almost anything that you want to set, as long as it's drilled through. And if you're smart, you'll check that the bead goes onto the wire first. I'm just going to show you now a very, very simple way to create a simple wrapped loop bail up at the top. And because we're working with a slightly heavier wire today, it will be perfectly adequate to wear almost straight away. So all we're going to do to finish off our design today is just put a forwards bend on that long tail of wire up at the top. I'm going to leave myself a little gap before I make that forwards bend, just shy of 90 degrees coming forwards like so. You can use any round form that you have, or you can use your bail makers if you have them. And I'm just going to create a rather oversized loop up at the top. So I've created the first part of that form like so. Pop the bail makers back into position and draw the tail around. So if you decide that that's actually a little bit too large for you, you can shrink that down quite easily. Bails don't have to be perfectly round. They could quite easily be slightly oval like this one. So I'm going to run the tail of the wire between thumb and forefinger a couple of times to make it nice and warm. I'm gripping very firmly on the round shape that we've created. I'm going to go around once, at least twice, and then I'm just going to tidy up that coil. Make sure that that loop at the top is straight and in the correct orientation, how I want it to fit. Now with this kind of design, you've got a couple of options. You can just completely fill the neckline, or you can add a second coil. I think I'm going to add another coil just underneath. Get that straightened up. A bit of a squish if it goes awry, and then draw the tail over the front. So that looks nice and neat, and most of all it looks sturdy and like it's going to last. So what I'm going to do now is to create another coil to just sit upwards in the opposite direction to the coil we put over the face of that gemstone earlier. So coils tend to be neater if you go at them a little bit more slowly. So take your time with your coils and they will end up slightly neater. So once I've built my coil, I'm just going to grip a hold of that bail and push the coil back by hand. So you can get those to sit how you want them to. I quite like them when they're like this because they look kind of equal and opposite. Make sure that your bail sits neatly. And you've got a couple of very, very quick and simple halo pendants. Well, thank you for joining me again here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you have a beautiful day and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.